Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Melissa and Punky, for having us here tonight. Dennis is in the front row. He's my eye candy. You can look but don't touch. We said when we came here that we had only been used to New England hospitality. We had lived in Cambridge for 31 years. And as a friend said, New England hospitality is a poke in the eye. It's been wonderful to be welcomed into this community and to work on bringing you all back to Monticello. It is a really important place with an important message at a time that needs all of our energies for a season of civic renewal, right? I think whatever you think about where we are in the country and its leadership right now, none of us can say that we have the civic skills needed in our young people to continue the experiment of self-government as robustly as it needs. That work is all on us as educators and as members of this polity. None of this has anything to do with John Singleton Copley, who was a civic coward. But anyway, it's a privilege to lead this institution and to be with you all tonight. I've talked a lot about Copley over the years. I have talked about him in London and all over the Northeast. I have only talked about him once before south of the Mason-Dixon, which was in Charlottesville. In fact, it was the only time I had been to Charlottesville before Molly Hardy plucked me out of obscurity and brought me here. So it'll be fun to talk about Copley so far from his backyards in Boston and in London. I wrote this book in New England, which is still very much Copley country. Let's make sure this is working. How about the other way? Still very much Copley country. Boston's Museum of Fine Arts stewards the greatest collection of the painter's work in the world. This is the current entrance to the main floor of its Art of the Americas wing, where we gaze at a gallery of Copley revolutionaries all along the left side there, and then that sort of sacred presentation of Revere, the Liberty Bowl, and Revere's silver on the side. Even when the MFA rehangs this Art of the Americas wing, which they're going to do for 2026, Revere will stay front and center as a kind of sacred object, and Copley will remain the only artist to have a solo artist gallery in that magnificent collection. But Copley also looms larger in a broader American imagination of the early Republic as the leading painter of the leading men and women of the American Revolution. In Ken Burns's forthcoming documentary series, The American Revolution, I'm just going to say this boldly, I don't know if it's true, but there are more frames. I would venture that there are more frames in the 60,000 images that you see over the period of 12 hours. There are more frames of Copley's art than any other single source. But while Copley produced the images of the American Revolution that we think we know, the war and the world he experienced offer a very different story, a kind of counter-narrative. So teasing out, this really does not want to listen to me, teasing out that hidden story and then thinking about how the revolution we know and the revolution we don't go together is the point of looking at the period through Copley's eyes, which is the gambit on the cover of the book. I have written 3 biographies of a certain type, which I would call Times and Life, on the principle that an era comes to life most vividly when we shrink the grain size down, when we look at it through the sort of variegated experience of one singular individual. People are complicated close in, which is why biography compels us. It's why Monticello compels us, right? We tell the biography of a complicated man. I'm a kind of accidental biographer. It's not how I was trained, but I've now, as Susan said, written 3 books of this times and life variety, each focused on a kind of revolutionary. So you see Copley on the left, and then at the top right is Andrew Dexter Jr., the paper money pioneer, con man, some might say, whose shenanigans I wrote about in a book called The Exchange Artist in 2008. And then below him is Candice Vidala with the stage name Candida Royale, who was an erotica entrepreneur whose contradictions are the subject of the book that I published last spring on the sexual revolution. What all 3 of these have in common, you may be wondering, how did a nice girl like that? That's next year's. What all 3 of these have in common is that they are ordinary people who lived in extraordinary times and both made history and were made by it. And I think that's the promise of this kind of work, right, is that even history makers, first of all, we all make history every day, right? And that's the civic capacity that we need right now, is to think of ourselves as founders every day of the nation that we care so much about. So we are all history makers, and even people who you've never heard of and whose contributions that you might not recognize or even particularly like are history makers. At the same time, we're all made by history. So even people like Jefferson and George Washington, who clearly changed the world, were also shaped by the world of their time. So I'm interested in that people as wet clay who history makes, as well as people who are makers of history. In a world that cares a lot about data, I hear there's a new data science thing down the hill, or some tens of thousands of square feet or something. I think about tiny data, right? I think about the power of one, and that's what I want to share by opening Copley's life. So Copley's American Revolution was not a straight line in the way that we think of, revolution as a takeoff point, but a circle, which is the way the word revolution was mostly used in his time, revolving around the sun. And so I'm going to start and conclude with this picture, which was his declaration of independence or interdependence, painted during the Revolutionary Year of 1776. We know from other people's diaries that it was what was on his easel that spring. A diarist noted seeing it in his painting rooms on April 1st, unfinished with the likenesses just coming into focus, which means it takes only a little bit of poetic license to say it was still there on the 4th of July. Grant me that license. This was the largest and most complex picture that Copley, who was then 38 years old, had ever painted. It was about 10 times the size of the bust lengths like Paul Revere. The picture contained his entire social, emotional, and political world. You see his beloved wife, Suki, with her little silk-clad foot on a tuffet there, his stern-faced father-in-law, Richard Clark, who had made everything about the outcomes in Copley's life both possible and inescapable. The artist himself is in the background, like the director of the scene, wearing this deep green velvet and trailing a romantic long queue of natural hair down his back. And then these 4 children displayed in the playful fashion that is a sort of new understanding of childhood in the late 18th century. One of the children, by the time Copley painted the scene, was dead, buried an ocean away, because the portrait was created in London. His easel was set up in elegant rented quarters at 12 Leicester Square in the fashionable West End near Soho, just around the square from the studio of Sir Joshua Reynolds, the most famous painter of the day, and near the British Museum. So all spring long, if we think about Copley's 1776, it's people coming in and out of this new home, talking about the American War. There are some records of people giving him pamphlets. I'm for America. I'm for Britain. Here is how Copley described the war with America when he first learned about the fighting in Lexington. Fighting in Lexington, of course, broke out in April of '75. He learns about it in July when he's on his grand tour of Italy 3 months later. He calls it a civil war, right? The flame of civil war is now broke out in America, and I have not the least doubt it will rage with violence equal to what it has ever done in any other country at any time. Copley felt relieved to be so far away from it. That's a funny kind of patriotism. At the same time that his Boston countrymen were actively calling a nation into being, at the same time Jefferson was writing a declaration with verbs like dissolve and pursue and publish and declare and pledge, Copley was reveling in the fact that he had run out of choices. And he says in this letter to his half-brother Henry Pelham, I should have found it difficult to have taken my tour if I had stayed in America longer than I did. And if I had left earlier, it would have been doing more violence to both myself and my dear wife to have fixed in England. In other words, it would have been harder to get her to stay in London. But now, and he's quite happy about this, now there is no choice left. So when we look at the American Revolution through Copley's eyes, we don't see a bold declaration in Jefferson's terms, but rather a very different mixture of choice and accident, dependence and independence and interdependence. And Copley is a character who shows this sort of understory of the American Revolution in especially sharp relief for a variety of reasons, chiefly because he was a painter, right? Like we see this conflict through his brush. So I'm going to start at the beginning with Copley's birth in Boston. I promise I'm not going to talk about every year. With Copley's birth in Boston, which began marketing itself as the cradle of liberty as early as the 1790s. By the centennial of the United States in 1876, this slogan, Cradle of American Liberty, was all but trademarked. It was part of Boston's sense of itself and of a burgeoning tourist economy, too. That tourist and cultural economy included the new Museum of Fine Arts, which opened that year, facing an open plaza that came to be called Copley Square. As Boston claimed Copley as a favored native son, the MFA treated Paul Revere, which came to the museum from the sitter's descendants in the 1930s, as a sacred and patriotic object. And here's how it was shown in the MFA's rotunda in 1951. So I'm a Catholic girl. I know that's an altar. Steps that almost ask you to genuflect before it, and flanked by the flag of the Commonwealth and the United States. It's important, I think, one of the things that biography teaches us, and it sounds so obvious. I spend my whole life stating the obvious, right? Never be afraid to state the obvious. We can only look at history backwards, but people experience it facing forwards. And Copley, when he was born in 1738, in this Boston, this little peninsula, was not born in the future United States, right? He didn't grow up saying someday this will be a great country. He was born in the oceanic world of Britain's Western Empire. Like a lot of maps of the period. Okay. I'm not going to screw things up with the pointer, which I can't get to work. Like a lot of maps of the period, this one is oriented toward the east rather than towards the north, and it's because the east, the harbor, I'm zooming in on that detail, is the most important feature of this seaport, which is a trading entrepot in a city-state. Copley spent his childhood living in one of those little wooden houses, maybe shacks would be a better word, along Boston's Long Wharf. He was the child of immigrants, which is relatively unusual in 18th century New England, which is a long-lived place. His parents were from Ireland, part of the second wave of Irish immigration to Boston in the 1730s. His father was a ne'er-do-well from Limerick, There should be a limerick about that. And his mother was fallen gentry from County Clare, and how they connected, I have not found records to tell me. Copley's America had very different components and linkages than the United States, which would claim him. The United States was a country in which he never set foot. Copley's Boston was a second-tier British seaport in a world of 21 British American colonies when he was born in 38, which would grow to 26 after the French and Indian War and Britain's claiming of a number of French possessions. Copley's Boston had closer ties to Jamaica and Barbados and Nova Scotia, to Ireland and to England, and even to the western coast of Africa than it did to Philadelphia or to New York. There was no natural group of 13 that was sitting there waiting to be a circle on a flag in the sort of milieu of his youth, not in trading, not in culture, not in politics. London was the capital city that all of these colonies recognized as the center of these disparate provinces. And people in Copley's Boston, including Copley himself, had this very poignant expression where they called London home, even when they had never seen it. I think this is a sort of feature in the immigrant imagination, right? I'm dreaming of home when you've never been there. Copley begins in the 1760s to write letters to people in London asking how they do it at home. Some of the first pictures Copley ever painted were copies from European prints, were seascapes, again, that orientation toward the ocean and trade. This is a piece of Copley Juvenilia painted when he was 16 called Galatea. It languishes in storage at the MFA. Like Boston itself, it depicts an oceanic world, and there are many things worth noting about it beyond the fact that it's pretty terrible, right, compared to what he would later do. It was a large picture, 3 feet by 4 feet, which is a serious investment in materials and time. It has a kind of game of telephone quality that's evocative of his life. And what I mean by that is it's a European print of a European painting that he can access only in a black and white group of prints, and has to sort of imagine it back into color. And one of the things I write about a lot in the early parts of the book is he lives in a visually impoverished world, right? He's living in a world of prints. There's a terribly poignant section of his life when Benjamin West, who he adopted as a kind of mentor by correspondence, goes to London in the early 1760s, and Copley is writing him and saying, what is blue, right? Like, I hear Titian uses a lot of blue. What does that look like, right? So there's an aspect to growing up in this colonial periphery that is a little bit like dreaming in color when you're blind. This is also a picture of an imperial world. So Galatea is a Greek myth, which was made famous and made British by Georg Friedrich Handel's 1718 oratorio, Acis and Galatea. That's why people were copying the print in the mid-18th century. So here we are in 1754 with a young man at age 16, a man of modest birth and rocky upbringing. His father died when he was quite young. Painting himself into the seat of metropolitan culture and trying to imagine a world in color. Copley lived in a world at war, and the American Revolution was seen through an imperial lens. The American Revolution was the 5th imperial war in a century fought for control of North America. So the American Revolution is also that, as well as our War of Independence. He wouldn't have known that he was born at the end of the longest period of peace that would prevail in North America for a century. He lived in wartime for 45 of his 77 years, so well more than half. His earliest surviving works date to 1753 and 1754, again, unbeknownst to him, the eve of the great global war that would come to be known as the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was really good for Copley and for a lot of people in provisioning hubs like Boston. It created a huge traffic in soldiers and imperial bureaucrats, and made fortunes for merchants and bespoke tradesmen, and a painter is a bespoke tradesman. The first time Copley's world burst into color, the color was British imperial red. And one of the things that when I taught the American Revolution, I always insisted on was North Americans loved red until they hated it. Right? The redcoats are coming in 1754 was a kind of booyah moment. Copley, between 1755 and 1760, garnered a large number of important commissions from soldiers and statesmen who wanted, as this is Major George Scott, to show themselves wrapped in the scarlet flag of empire. This is like wrapping yourself in the flag, as the phrase has it. These paintings haven't gotten a lot of attention because they're pretty formulaic military paintings, and the great sparkling talent that he would show a decade later isn't yet evident. But I put a lot of weight in his biography on the opportunity of these military commissions to build skills, to build networks, and to build his story as somebody who it was important to come to see as a tradesman in this post-war world. Copley's military commissions continued well past the end of the 7 Years' War. The most important of his redcoats, both artistically and biographically, is this dramatic 3/4 length portrait of General Thomas Gage, the commander of His Majesty's forces in North America. We know within about a 2-week period when Copley painted the portrait, the painting closely followed the landing of British troops in Boston, which Paul Revere commemorated with this famous engraving of the Redcoats landing in 1768. It's a belated engraving. He does it after the Boston Massacre to sort of drum up support for this story that there's been a kind of concentrated tyranny for years. So that's what brings Gage to Boston, right? The landing of the troops goes badly. The populace resists. Headquarters says, we've got to send the big boss up to quiet things. Gage comes and makes almost a Lafayette-like pilgrimage through Boston. He's at all of the finest tables. He brings people together. He succeeds, and that's when Copley painted him. The result of that collaboration is a canvas that could not be more different than Paul Revere, which was painted certainly within months and maybe within weeks. So this is a military portrait that follows Reynolds's Grand Manner works, which Copley would have known in engraved form, again as black and white prints. Gage is standing there with an officer's ramrod bearing, and he's offering a lesson with his baton, right? And pointing to columns of orderly troops in the background. There's an amateur art historian and dealer up in the North Shore of Boston who has made a pretty convincing argument that this is the Battle of Culloden in the background when the Jacobite rebellion is suppressed in Scotland in 1746. So it's Gage saying, behold the might of the British Army. An important commission for Copley. It produced his next venture when he went abroad, which is what he called it when he went to New York in 1771, where his commissions again followed a nexus of military connections because the society in Lower Manhattan concentrated around the fort there. So many of the other commissions he painted in the 6 months he was there also came through this network of imperial soldiers. So the 7 Years' War and the occupation, which is the first sort of tipping domino of the conventional American Revolution story, actually opened the world to a man who was born without any expectations for upward mobility. Copley sent this painting, which came to be known as Boy with a Flying Squirrel, and a detail of which I have a tattoo on my left arm. Truly, there's the squirrel. He painted this in 1765 to send to London. He painted it in the immediate wake of Boston's Stamp Act riots, an early indication that the peace that followed the 7 Years' War would be very costly to the empire. He was surely planning and painting this the entire year, maybe longer, as he built up a network of sea captains who could take it overseas to what was then the Society of Artists. It was before the Royal Academy opened. The Society of Artists, to see how he would fare hung along the wall with other Britons. And this is when he begins to correspond with West. The existence of the Society of Artists is itself a kind of artistic nationalism that comes out of the 7 Years' War. It's part of Britain's triumphalism as both a military and a cultural power. I think without the 7 Years' War and everything it brought to Copley by way of opportunities and connections, he would not have begun the kind of aspiration that he evidenced in his work later in the 1760s. So in late 1769, about a year after he painted General Gage and Paul Revere, Copley, who was a terribly indecisive person, right, as any others, right, like as most of us are as we confront life decisions. In 1769, he made the most important decision of his life when he married Susanna Farnham Clark, the daughter of that wealthy Boston merchant who you saw in his family picture. It was both a love match and a tactical match, like every marriage at the time and like probably every marriage since. He married for love and for status, right? They would have thought of status rather than fortune. The marriage was late by the standards of his time. He was 31, again, indecisive. Was a huge social climb for him, an economic climb for him. I often picture what Richard Clark must have said when his daughter Susanna, aka Suki, came home and said, "I've fallen in love with a painter." All the other children in the Clark family married merchants. At the time of his marriage, Copley was a soft liberty man in the evolving revolutionary crisis. Went to dinners with the Sons of Liberty. His father-in-law, a Caribbean importer, also was a supporter of the colonial boycotts, however reluctantly, right? You went along to get along. Copley's distinctive family of origin, the fact that he didn't have a patriarch in the family after he was around the age of 3. His father died when he was around the age of 3. Single mother, no male adult kin, means that Susanna's father, Richard Clark, was the only real paternal figure Copley had ever had. And the marriage, as marriages did and do, produced new kinds of independence, but also new relationships of dependency and interdependence. A lot of things came to Copley with this marriage. He gained landed prosperity. He was living in a rented house before then, but he gained this inset that I've shown up there is labeled as Copley's Hill on this map. He gained about 10 acres on the north side of Boston Common. Almost certainly, though I cannot document this, almost certainly his wife's marriage portion, a gentleman farm, and what he does with the gentleman farm is very extensively documented. He gained children, born at very regular intervals, the first almost exactly 9 months after the marriage, young John Jr. or Jackie, and then at the sort of standard 18 to 24 month intervals after that. He seemed at this point, say we're 2 or 3 years into his marriage, to be feathering his nest to make his future in Boston. Still, he was planning a painting trip to England, but he put it off in 1773 because his wife was again pregnant with their third child, Polly, who was born that fall. After his marriage, Copley's growing liberty was also directly bound up with chattel slavery, that most American of contradictions, and one that Britons had begun to mock in the freedom-claiming Americans, right? The famous Samuel Johnson line, how is it that we see the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? We know that at least 3 bondspeople joined Copley's household in the immediate wake of his marriage. I believe they were presents. There was a young boy called Snap, probably from the Caribbean, where Suki's father had sugar and rum business. There was a girl called Lucy, who we know about because there's a record when Copley sold her in 1771. And then there's an older boy or young man called Cato, who we learn about because Copley, because he married in Boston in the 1770s, and that created a church record. We don't know who the person is in this picture, which Copley painted as a study. You'll see it as the apex figure in his Watson and the Shark in a few minutes. But it's clear from the familiarity of the portrait that this is somebody known very well to the family. The oil sketch stays in the family into the 1860s and is now at the Detroit Art Institute. It's not clear whether Copley had servants black or white, free or enslaved in his later life, but slavery continues to braid through the family story, as you'll hear when we get to his children. Marriage also provoked Copley to take that trip abroad to New York, sort of broadened the circle of his ambition, which he did in 1771. And in addition to those military likenesses working his way around Fort George, he painted this spectacular painting of Margaret Kemble Gage, the general's wife, which Copley himself called the greatest female portrait he had ever made. And it is worth the trip to the tiny, tiny Timken Museum in San Diego's Balboa Park to see it. And then the other thing that came into his life with this marriage was tea. So Richard Clark traded in sugar and in rum in the Caribbean, and also in tea, first smuggled tea that came to the Caribbean. And then in the summer of 1773, Copley's brother-in-law, his father-in-law's son, Jonathan, had what he thinks is fantastic good luck, which is that he won a consignment license from the East India Company to directly sell East India Company tea into the Boston market. East India Company tea was a good bet and a good deal for colonials. It was much cheaper. It cut out the middlemen. The gambit was that it was going to compete with smuggled tea on price and exceed quality and save the East India Company in the process. That, not tyrannizing America, is the logic behind the Tea Act. So that on December 16th, 1773, when 347 chests of East India Company tea are dumped into Boston Harbor, more than 100 of those belonged to Copley's father-in-law. This is the most magnificent movement of all John Adams wrote in his diary the next morning. The destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, so intrepid and inflexible that it must have important consequences, and so lasting that I cannot but consider it as an epocha in history. I recently searched the Adams correspondence for how many times he had said something was an epocha in history. He's like the guy who predicted 10 of the 3 stock market crashes. Anyway, that's an often quoted line from Adams. It appears in a lot of American history textbooks. Less regularly quoted is the next sentence. Many persons wish, and he's here in Boston, many persons wish that as many dead carcasses were floating in the harbor as there are chests of tea. And Adams went on to name the governor and the tea consignees as, quote, persons so hardened and abandoned that they had proved implacable in the face of the king's tyranny and the people's distress. The message in the diary was they deserved what was coming to them, and Copley's father-in-law was one of them, maybe the second chief deplorable. He spent, the father and brothers spent the winter in the fortified prison in Boston Harbor, right in the British fort, unable to come to town. There are signs all over Boston saying what will happen to them if they show their faces in town. So after this moment in December of 1773, Copley's marriage became the most important decision in his life in a different way than he had anticipated, because he married his politics and ultimately his citizenship. So for all of these reasons, and I know I said that this was the beginning and the end picture, but this is not the last time I'm going to show it, so don't get faked out. For all of these reasons, for family and war and calling and empire, and with only a tiny smattering of ideology, Copley's revolution led him home to London, where the family portrait sat on his easel in the spring of 1776, while his Boston neighbors, including Sam Adams and John Hancock, whom he had painted and grown fully and perhaps deservedly to despise, had begun drafting a document declaring the independence of a nation that Copley would never share or even see. So I want briefly to talk about his predicament in the back half of his life, where he is too American to pass as a Briton and too British to ever come back. So lived and read and seen from London, Copley's American Revolution was Britain's American War. That no choice left war that he expressed relief about in that letter I showed you earlier, and soon for Britain a losing war. So that Copley's art in London was painting scenes of trying to win at art by painting losing, right? Like imagine this, right? Imagine you're in the United States as a figurative painter in the 1960s, and your subject is Vietnam, right? Who wants that, right? Who wants to reckon with the great subject of the day? His pictures got large and busy and complex and vivid. He was able to paint in London something that really did not exist in the United States, which was public art, right? There were no museums or galleries, no state or municipal sponsorship in the Boston that he left, but London had the Royal Academy and the Society of Arts. The dilemma in London, if that's the opportunity, right? You can paint things with collective patronage rather than the portrait, which is the genre at which he excels, but which does not rank high in the hierarchy of genres as people classify them at the time. So that's the opportunity. The predicament is, how can he paint the American War in a way that Britons are going to want to see it and think about it? And this becomes his niche. However much he tried to escape it, it became his great and defining subject. It must have been a little like bringing Springsteen up, who wants to play his new stuff, and someone says, Could you please do Born to Run again? The American War was his claim to bona fides in the British Academy and to public attention. It was his springboard, and then it was his millstone. And in different ways, the American Revolution is the subject of all of his great London pictures. It's the subject of Watson and the Shark, painted in 1778, looking back to the time that Britain conquered Havana Harbor. So showing an imperial moment when Britain is hugely successful, painted the year that France enters the war and it becomes, if not unwinnable, a certainly doubtful victory for Britain. The American Revolution is the subject of his Death of the Earl of Chatham, which convulsed thousands of people when he showed this picture in a tent in Hyde Park in 1781. Chatham had stroked out on the floor of Parliament, actually inveighing against American independence, right, and looking for a middle way for the empire to come back. It is the subject of the very, wait, I had one more. No, all right. Sorry, I'm going to describe something that I forgot to put in the deck. It's the subject of an enormous and belated painting called The Siege and Relief of Gibraltar. It hangs in Guildhall. It's so large that they can't remove it. They can only cover it when they bring in other exhibitions. And he painted that in 1791, still trying to make the subject command attention as England's eyes turned to France and the beginning of the Napoleonic War. But the British painting I want to dig into a bit. My favorite is The Death of Major Pearson, which has not been seen in the United States for decades. It's at Tate Britain in London. So this is the third, and I think the greatest, of his American War history paintings, which celebrates a battle and even a theater of the American Revolution that you have probably, unless you are a real military history geek, never have considered, which is the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. When I tell people it's the Battle of Jersey, they think, like, is that like Monmouth? No, it's the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. The battle, such as it was, took place in January of 1781. It featured no North American combatants, and I think this is a key to the way that Copley threads the needle in his American Revolution pictures in London, is the British become the heroes, but the Americans are not the enemy. That's the sniveling French that you can see, forgive me, Monsieur Lafayette, in buff-colored uniforms around the edges. In fact, the Britons in this skirmish had no official enemies at all. The British garrison defended itself against a rump group of French legionnaires whose actions the government in Paris immediately disavowed. The battle lasted 15 minutes. It was inglorious. The governor of Jersey, the British governor of Jersey, was court-martialed for his dereliction in preparation. This gallant young major, who no one had ever heard of in the middle, Major Pearson, died. And when London newspapers wrote first about Pearson's death and then about the picture, they had to remind the newspaper reading public not only who Major Pearson had been, but where the Isle of Jersey was and why it was important to fight for in the war. And the answer was, better us than France. So one of Copley's greatest paintings celebrates the heroism of a minor major, a man of sympathy and feeling who gave his life in a theater that really didn't matter, in a war that Britain, by the time Copley began this project in 1782, had already lost. It was exhibited in 1784 in Green Park in London after the Peace of Paris, which created the United States and ratified that hyphenated British America of Copley's life was gone forever, had already been signed. In one of the most striking passages in the painting, Copley celebrates what people of the day called British or English liberty. If you watched the History Channel's Thomas Jefferson last week, you'll have seen this image standing in for Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment here in Virginia. It's no such thing. The person avenging Pearson's death is a servant of African descent, shown in his owner's livery. This is not a military costume, but actually livery. And I was able to find him, which I'm super proud of. Find him in the records because he was a witness in a divorce suit in Britain in the 1780s. So this man was born in the Carolinas, enslaved in the Carolinas, and he was one of those who took the British promise that if you came and fought for the crown, you would be free. He first fought behind Eastern lines in the North American Continental Theater, and then in this odd front in the middle of the northern part of it's the Atlantic, right? Jersey's in the Atlantic. It's the English Channel. I was going to call it the Mediterranean, and then that would be in the Daily Progress. And he wound up in London as a hairdresser, which was a skill trade all but inconceivable to a black man born in the Carolinas. So one of the things Copley is saying here is Britain is winning the war to embody liberty, even as it's losing the rebel colonies. The other really striking passage in the convention of a battle painting is there are women and children fleeing in the front, this group of non-combatants that I've circled there. And they are Copley's wife and son and baby daughter, who were not at the Battle of Jersey, but who were exiles, right? They were driven by battle into another part of their lives. So Copley asked his brother in correspondence when the Civil War in America had broke out, and he learned about it in Italy, how short a way do we penetrate into the secrets of futurity? And I was going to say this is the question of the historian, but it's really the question of human life, right? How clearly, we can't even see where we are. How clearly can we see what is coming? One of the things that I think a close view of Copley's predicament and his non-choices reveals is the difference that it makes to see history forward, not knowing the answer to what futurity will bring. This was especially true of the world of the American Revolution, which has come to seem, in retrospect, like it was tidy and foreordained, right? Like Hancock and his ink big enough for the king to see it without his spectacles knew the ending of the script, but in fact nobody did. The American Revolution was a project, I would argue an ongoing project, not a kind of mythic destiny. Like everybody else in this room, certainly at least like me, Copley saw into the future well in some ways and poorly in others. For example, he was confident from the time he wrote this letter that the United States would win, or that the Americans, as he called them then, would win. He put it elsewhere in the letter that at the end of it, when the bleeding stopped, quote, "the Americans will be a free and independent people." Nobody would have said this, and no sane person would have said this in the summer of 1775. He did not mean that as a compliment. For as he went on to explain to his hot-headed little stepbrother, the strife would not end with independence. The country, he said, would be, quote, "torn in pieces twice," quote, "first by the quarrel with Great Britain till it is a distinct government, and then with civil discord till time has settled it into some permanent form." And he goes on to say whether that form would be free or despotic is beyond the reach of human wisdom to decide. We're still in it, right? And so his advice to his stepbrother Harry was, and this is the perspective of the neutral. Neutrals are hard to find It's easy to find patriots, it's easy to find loyalists, the shape-shifting people in the middle, just wondering what is best for them at the end of the day, are really hard to find. There's no like, let me sign up for the Neutrality Association. His advice to his brother is, no matter who asks you to, don't pick up a gun. That's why he's trying to look into futurity. All right, so this is the slide of Gibraltar that I thought I had earlier. So artistically, in terms of finding custom, he glimpsed the future quite poorly. He hung on to the American War much too long, in part because he was such a poor decider. He proceeded deliberately and he painted slowly, and this is the last and largest of his American War paintings. It's about 18 by 25 feet. It's almost, you can't see it, right? It's not in a big enough room to be able to take it in. It's in many ways a failure. The Siege of Gibraltar had ended 9 years before he finished the painting, and by then everybody was talking about Napoleon. The American War remained an open wound in Britain. There was a theatrical staged suicide in front of the painting when it was being displayed in an enormous tent in Green Park by a British-American War veteran whose service had not been rewarded with a pension. But by then, most Londoners had moved on to the next war, the one that began in France with the fall of the Bastille in 1789 and would continue with only brief interruption for the rest of Copley's life. He died in 1815. Artistically, he missed that war. He missed painting Admiral Nelson, who became the meal ticket for British painters of the 1790s, in the way that George Washington was for American painters of the 1780s and 1790s. Gilbert Stuart called Washington his $100 bill. Copley hung on to what for Britons was a mercifully fading memory of the loss of American, and hung on to his own losses too. If family was the realm in life in which Copley was most decisive, this is still not the last one, I don't want to fake you out. Family was the realm in which he best grasped and most fully made his own futurity. During the Grand Tour, he had said that his highest goal was to bring his children into the great world, that is, into London society, with reputation. And my core commitment is to take that family history as seriously as political history in this book. And in that goal, he succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. His surviving son, John Singleton Copley Jr., became Lord Lyndhurst, Lord High Chancellor, and a peer of the new creation. Lyndhurst visited the United States in 1796 and thought briefly of building a western estate there of hundreds of acres for his parents to retire on. But in the end, having seen the democratic experiment of America in the 1790s, he said, hell no, and went back and rose in Britain. His daughter Betsy, the first of his children and the middle character in that family portrait, and this later picture sort of picks up on that family portrait design, also succeeded. In 1800, at the ripe age of 30, she married back to America, but not to Copley's America, this new United States he had never seen. Like her father, she also married into a slaving fortune made by her husband's Demerara plantations in the Caribbean. They lived in Beacon Hill in grand style. Their money saved Copley in his declining years and funded her brother's rise through the British legal establishment. Betsy and her husband had a large staff of servants, including several free African Americans and at least one enslaved man named Harry, who was also Gardner Green's son. When Gardner Green died in 1832, he manumitted Harry in his will. Slavery had been illegal in Boston since 1784. This means that Harry Green was one of the last, if not the last, enslaved man in Boston,
and Betsy Copley Green, one of the last slaveholders. That interdependence of slavery and liberty there in Copley's life as in the country to the last. Time is cruel. Betsy Copley, I love the parrot. I love the Monty Python parrot. Betsy Copley lived for decades after her husband passed. Here she is in a studio portrait taken in Boston in 1862. She and her brother, it's like the last living revolutionary widow tells all. She and her brother, Lord Lyndhurst, and her spinster sister Mary met regularly in Europe in that new tourist economy for the bakers, right, in the 1840s. All three of Copley's children lived into their 90s and died during the Civil War. All of them called the Civil War a revolution, just as Copley had called the revolution a civil war. Lord Lyndhurst, who kept all the pictures that didn't sell, died first in 1862. And when his estate and all of their painted patrimony went under the gavel, Betsy, who was still ill to travel, sent emissaries to London to bid on the art. It was her agents who brought to the United States many of the Copley treasures that decorate our museums across the country, including Watson and the Shark, the family picture, and several others. Many of these works hang in Boston and elsewhere in museums' American wings, and we sometimes like to think, and art historians sometimes write of their return as a repatriation, right? America got the goods back. But in fact, it wasn't a homecoming for these pictures, not really. Copley's America was long gone. When those paintings left Britain, they left the only country Copley had ever known. This is the last one. Today, the family picture hangs just 100 miles north of us in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. As a piece of the National Gallery's collection, it is part of the cultural patrimony of the United States. But the NGA has hung it, I think rightly, upstairs in the West Wing in a British and European gallery, set alongside the great works of Joshua Reynolds, George Romney, Thomas Gainsborough, and others of Copley's peers who, like him, were British artists from cradle to grave. Thank you.